In the autumn of 1886, in the Sweetwater Valley of Wyoming Territory, people watched a widow do something that made no sense. She wasn't stacking firewood. She wasn't patching her roof. She was carrying jars. Jar after jar after jar, down a ladder, into the dark, until her cellar held 400 of them, shoulder to shoulder, like an army waiting for orders. The valley had a word for a winter that killed you slow. They were about to learn a new one: siege. Because before the snow was finished with Sweetwater Valley, one question would decide who lived and who didn't. What have you buried against the cold? Everyone believed they already knew the answer. They were wrong. Stay until the end, because the two thermometers you're about to see settled an argument nobody thought could be settled. And if you've never heard how 400 jars became the difference between a grave and a kitchen table, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Subscribe now, because you won't believe what was waiting behind that cellar door in January. Her name was Esther Calloway. And by the time the leaves turned that year, she had been a widow for 3 winters. Her husband Daniel had died the way too many men died in that country. Not in a gunfight, not in a stampede, but 10 yards from his own porch, in a whiteout that came down off the Wind River peaks in less than an hour and swallowed the world whole. He'd gone out to check on a heifer. He never made it back. They found him in March, when the drifts finally let go of him, less than the length of a wagon from his own front door. Esther had not remarried. She had not gone back east to her sister's house in Ohio, though she'd been asked more than once. She stayed on the homestead with her daughter May, 8 years old and quiet in the way children get quiet when they've watched their mother carry grief without ever once setting it down, and with an old blue heeler named Rook, who slept at the foot of Esther's bed every night since Daniel's funeral and had never once slept anywhere else. Grief in that country did not get talked about. It got worked into the ground, worked into the woodpile, worked into whatever a person built next. What Esther built next was a cellar full of jars. It started small enough that nobody noticed. A few extra quarts of green beans in July. Some pickled beets in August that seemed like more than any one household needed. But by September, when the wagon from Casper came through with a load of empty mason jars, 200 of them paid for with money nobody in town could account for, the whispering started in earnest. By October, the count stood past 300, and Esther Calloway was hauling jars down into that cellar like a woman digging her own grave and filling it with preserves instead of dirt. By the first hard frost in November, the number had reached 400. 400 jars of tomatoes, beans, corn, venison packed in its own fat, wild plums, chokecherry syrup, bone broth sealed thick with tallow. 400 jars, standing in ranks 3 deep against every wall of a cellar that most families in the valley would have called modest for 80. The town gave it a name before Esther ever gave it a purpose. Ada Measham, who ran the mercantile and knew every piece of business in Sweetwater before the person doing the business knew it themselves, was the one who said it first, leaning across her counter to a row of nodding customers. That woman's building herself a glass grave. The name? Caught. Men touched their hats and said it like a joke that wasn't quite a joke. Children whispered it, walking past the Calloway fence line. The glass grave. Esther heard it, more than once, carried to her on the wind, the way cruel words always find their way to the person they're about. She never answered it. She never explained herself in the mercantile, never corrected a rumor at church, never once raised her voice to defend 400 jars of food. She only kept carrying jars down the ladder, one at a time, until her hands bled through her gloves and healed and bled again Silence, in that country, was its own kind of armor. Esther wore it well. It was May who carried the worst of it, the way children always carry a mother's reputation without ever having asked to. A boy at the schoolhouse had taken to calling her jar girl in the yard, and May came home one October afternoon with her chin tucked to her chest and her eyes red from more than wind. Esther sat her daughter down at the kitchen table that evening, poured her a cup of warm cider, and told her the only thing she knew to tell her. Let them laugh now, May. Laughing is cheap. It costs a person nothing. What we're building costs something. And by the time winter's done asking its questions, we'll know exactly what it was worth. May didn't fully understand it. Not that night. But she stopped coming home with her chin tucked down after that, and she started asking, instead, if she could carry a jar down the ladder herself. What nobody in Sweetwater Valley knew, what Esther had never told a soul, not even the preacher, not even Ada Meacham on the rare afternoons they still spoke like the old friends they'd once been, was that she had learned this from her grandfather, a Pennsylvania stonemason named Jacob Voss, who had crossed the Atlantic as a boy and spent 60 years building things that outlasted him. Esther had spent 3 childhood summers in his workshop, watching him lay stone the old way, and she remembered one afternoon in particular, cold for June, when she'd asked him why he packed his root cellars so tight, floor to ceiling. Nothing wasted, nothing left hollow. He'd set down his trowel, looked at her the way old men look at children they've decided are finally old enough to hear something true, and said the words she would carry with her the rest of her life. The cold doesn't hunt the strong, Esther. It hunts the hollow. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, kneeling in a cellar in Wyoming, with her husband 3 winters dead, and a house that had felt hollow ever since. A cellar with empty shelves was a cellar the cold could find. A cellar packed solid, packed with mass, with weight, with 400 jars of stored heat from a Wyoming summer, was a cellar the cold had to fight for. Glass remembers summer, her grandfather used to say. Give it enough jars, and it won't let go of it easily. That was the secret nobody in Sweetwater Valley had bothered to ask her about. They'd only asked each other, over counters and fences, what in God's name that widow thought she was doing. The most respected man in the valley thought he knew exactly what she was doing, and he thought it would kill her. Thomas Ridgway ran the largest cattle operation for 30 miles in any direction, had survived 4 Wyoming winters that had broken lesser outfits, and was not a man given to mockery. When he rode out to the Calloway place in early November, hat in hand, it wasn't to laugh. It was to warn her. He stood at the top of her cellar stairs, looking down at 400 jars gleaming faintly in lantern light, and he said what any careful man would have said. Packed that tight, with no room to breathe, the moisture of all that food would condense on the walls and rot her shelving inside a month. Glass jars that close together in a hard enough freeze would crack against each other and split, and she'd lose the food and cut herself besides on broken glass in the dark. And even if none of that happened, even if the jars held and the shelves held, a root cellar that shallow, hers was barely 6 feet down, dug the same year Daniel died and never finished properly. Couldn't hold heat against a real Wyoming winter, no matter what she put in it. I've lost cattle to cold that laughed at deeper holes than this one, Mrs. Calloway, he told her, not unkindly. I'd hate to see you lose more than jars. He wasn't finished. He'd built 3 root cellars in his time in the valley, he told her, and lost toes to all 3 before he'd learned the hard way what worked and what didn't. A cellar needed room to breathe, he said. The same as a barn needed room for the horses to move. Pack it too tight, seal it too close, and a body was just building a cold box with extra steps. The cold would find its way in regardless, and when it did, it would have nowhere to go and nothing to do but sit there and finish the job slow. It was, by any measure a rancher could offer, sound advice from a man who had buried more of his own mistakes than most. Esther listened to every word of it. She thanked him for his concern and meant it. And then she went back to carrying jars. Through the whole of that autumn, Esther Calloway built the way her grandfather had taught her to build. Slow, tactile, exact. She dug the cellar 2 feet deeper and widened it by 4, hauling dirt out by the bucketful, with May passing empty buckets down and hauling full ones up, day after day, until the girl's small hands were as calloused as her mother's. She lined the new walls with fieldstone hauled from the creek bed a half-mile off, stone she and May dragged home on a travois built from lodgepole pine, 3 or 4 rocks at a time, because that was all the 2 of them together could manage. She packed the gaps between stone and earth with straw, then packed a second layer of straw, a full 18 inches thick between the cellar's outer wall and the earth beyond it, because still air, her grandfather always said, insulated better than anything money could buy. It simply had to be trapped, not moving, held in place like a held breath. She built shelving out of green lodgepole that would cure hard over the winter, shelving strong enough to hold 400 jars 3 rows deep without a single board bowing under the weight. And she left, deliberately, a gap of exactly 2 inches between the top course of jars and the cellar's low ceiling, a gap her grandfather had called the breathing line, because a cellar packed too tight in every direction was as much a mistake as one left too empty. It needed one place, and only one, for warm, moist air to move, slow and steady, toward a vent she'd built into the northeast corner, using an old stovepipe elbow scavenged off a burned-out claim shanty. Every jar she carried down those stairs, she wiped clean and checked the seal on twice, once by ear, listening for the flat, dead sound of a good seal against her thumbnail, and once by eye, watching for the telltale dome of a lid that hadn't quite pulled down tight. 400 jars. 400 small sons, she called them once to May, half joking, half serious, because that's what they were, each one holding a piece of a Wyoming summer, sealed in glass, waiting to give it back. By late August, the shelves along the east wall stood finished, holding 100 jars and no more, and Esther had begun to wonder, in her quieter moments, whether Ridgway might be right after all. By the middle of October, the number had climbed past 250. The stone walls were dry and cool to the touch, and the breathing line drew a slow, steady thread of air out through the stovepipe elbow whenever she held a candle flame near it. Proof, her grandfather would have said, that the cellar was alive and working the way it should. By the 9th of December, 3 days before the valley went still, the count reached 400 exactly, and Esther marked the date in the family Bible the way her grandfather had once marked the completion of every wall he'd ever built. Because a finished thing, he always said, deserved to be remembered by its date. Measuring, packing, checking, rebuilding, pull, adjust, check the seal. The work never varied, and it never let up, not for 6 straight weeks, until her palms were leather and her back ached in a way it hadn't since she was a girl hauling stone with her grandfather in Pennsylvania. The failure came in the 3rd week of November, and it nearly proved Thomas Ridgway right. Esther woke one morning to a smell she recognized instantly and hated, sour, faintly sweet. The smell of something gone wrong under a lid that should have held. She found it at the back of the third shelf. 6 jars of venison, their seals broken, the meat inside spoiled past saving. And worse, a slick film of condensation running down the stone wall behind them. Exactly the rot Ridgway had warned her about. For a full day, Esther did nothing but sit with the problem, turning it over the way her grandfather had taught her to turn over any failure, not as a verdict on the whole plan, but as a single loose stone in an otherwise sound wall. By evening, she had found it. The northeast vent, the breathing line, had been built too narrow and had choked itself with frost, and with no way for that trapped moisture to escape, it had condensed instead on the coldest surface it could find. The back wall, closest to the open ground above. She tore the vent out that same night by lantern light, rebuilt it twice as wide, angled it downward so meltwater would run out instead of back in, and packed a second breathing line along the base of the back wall she hadn't thought to build the first time. She lost 6 jars. She did not lose her nerve. A system that bends and gets stronger, her grandfather used to say, is worth more than one that never gets tested at all. By the first week of December, the cellar held again. Steady, dry, 400 jars minus 6, breathing exactly the way it was supposed to. Then, in the second week of December, the valley went still in a way that old-timers didn't like to talk about. Rook, who had slept at the foot of Esther's bed every single night for 3 years without fail, stopped sleeping there at all. He took to lying instead against the cellar door, nose pressed to the crack at the base of it, ears up, even in his sleep. Geese that should have had another 2 weeks in them left the Sweetwater in a single morning, all at once, calling low and urgent, gone south before the frost had even properly silvered the grass. Old Henry Dobbs, who'd read weather in that valley for 40 years and had never once been badly wrong about it, rode into town on the 14th of December and said to anyone who'd listen that he didn't like the quiet. Not the ordinary winter quiet, a held-breath quiet. The wind, which never fully stopped in Sweetwater Valley, stopped for nearly 6 hours on the morning of December 15th. Nothing moved. Not a branch, not a strand of grass, not a cloud. Esther stood on her porch that morning with May's hand in hers, and Rook pressed against her leg, and she felt it the way her grandfather had once told her a person feels a held breath right before the room lets it go. The sky to the north had gone the color of an old bruise, low and heavy and strangely close, as though the whole valley had been tucked beneath a lid. Not a single crow called, not a single branch moved. Even the smoke from her own chimney seemed to hang straight up without drifting, as if the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. Something was coming. Nobody in the valley yet had a name for it. They would have one soon enough. It came down out of the north on the night of December 16th like a verdict nobody could appeal. Later, the survivors would call it the Long Siege, and the name would stick for the rest of their lives. 11 straight days of temperatures that never once climbed above 0, and a first night blizzard so total that men lost between their own houses and their own barns, no more than 40 feet apart, wandered in circles until they found a fence line to follow home by feel alone. The thermometer nailed to the Sweetwater Mercantile read 39 degrees below 0 on the morning of the 18th, and it did not warm meaningfully for 11 days after that. Nature had arrived, and nature, as it always did in that country, never negotiated its verdicts. It did not care who had mocked whom. It did not care whose cellar was full and whose was empty. It only asked one question of every homestead in the valley. What have you buried against me? And it went, house by house, looking for the answer. The same patient, impartial judge it had always been, indifferent to the arguments of mercantile counters and church pews alike. The Pruitt cellar failed on the third night. The Meacham well froze solid on the fifth. Cattle by the hundreds simply lay down in the drifts across the open range and did not get up again, the way cattle do when cold stops being weather and starts being something closer to a verdict handed down without appeal. The cold did not hunt the strong. It hunted the hollow, exactly as an old Pennsylvania stonemason had once told a little girl it would. And Sweetwater Valley, that December, was about to learn precisely how many of its houses were hollow and how many weren't. On the fourth night of the siege, with the outside temperature holding at 31 below, and the wind screaming loud enough to drown out thought, Esther Calloway nearly lost everything she'd built. The stovepipe vent she'd rebuilt in November had iced over solid from the outside, a 2-inch crust of frozen condensation sealing it shut completely. And without that breathing line, the moisture trapped inside the cellar had nowhere left to go. She discovered it at midnight when she went down to check the jars and found the air inside gone thick and wrong, felt rather than seen, the first warning sign of a system beginning to choke on itself. She had perhaps 2 hours before that trapped moisture began condensing hard enough to threaten every seal in the room. There was only one way to clear that vent, and it meant going outside. Esther wrapped herself in every layer of wool she owned, tied a rope from her waist to the porch post the way Daniel had taught her years before he died, and went out into 31 degrees below zero with a fire poker and her bare determination. Because gloves thick enough to survive that cold were too thick to do the work her fingers needed to do. She found the vent by feel, half blind and blowing snow that stung like sand thrown at close range, and she broke the ice from it in small, careful pieces, knowing that one wrong strike could crack the pipe itself and undo 3 months of work in a single second. Tap. Listen. Tap again. The wind screamed past her ears loud enough to erase every other sound in the world. Loud enough that she couldn't hear her own breathing, couldn't hear Rook barking frantic, and muffled from somewhere behind the cabin door. It took her the better part of an hour. Her hands went from pain to numbness to something she didn't have a word for, something past cold entirely, a stinging ache that had stopped feeling like her own hands at all. Twice she lost her grip on the poker in the dark and had to search the snow for it on her knees, patting blind through drifts already swallowing her forearms. When the vent finally cleared and she felt the first thread of warm, moist cellar air breathe out past her frozen fingers into the killing night, she nearly wept from the relief of it. A small, ordinary miracle, invisible to anyone but her. She followed her rope back to the porch on hands that could no longer properly grip it, pulling herself hand over hand through snow already knee-deep and rising, and she made it inside only minutes, she would say later, before she stopped being able to make it at all. May was waiting at the door with a lantern and a blanket, too frightened to cry. And it was Rook, pressing his full weight against Esther's frozen legs the moment she collapsed onto the cabin floor, who seemed to understand before either of them said a word that the worst of it had passed. The cellar held. She had made certain of it. The cold hunts the hollow, her grandfather's voice said to her that night, as clear as if he'd been standing beside her in the storm. It had come looking. It had not found any. By the 9th day of the long siege, the numbers had stopped being a matter of opinion in Sweetwater Valley. because two thermometers told a story that required no interpretation at all. Thomas Ridgway, whose own root cellar had frozen through on the third night, arrived at Esther Calloway's door on foot, having walked the better part of 2 miles through drifts up to his chest because his horses were too weak from cold to be ridden. He had come, he said, because word had reached him, carried by a neighbor who'd carried it from another neighbor, that the widow's cellar had somehow held warm through the worst cold anyone in the valley could remember. He wanted to see it with his own eyes before he'd believe it. Esther led him down the cellar stairs without a word of pride in her step. And there, mounted at eye level on the stone wall, exactly where her grandfather would have mounted one, hung a small brass thermometer. It read 41 degrees. 41 degrees. In a winter that had not let the outside world above 39 below in 9 straight days. Ridgway said nothing at first. He walked the length of the cellar, ran a bare, wind-cracked hand along the fieldstone wall, felt the faint, steady warmth radiating off 400 jars packed floor to ceiling like living things, each one holding just enough of a Wyoming summer to give a little of it back. Then he pulled a second thermometer from his coat pocket, the one, he admitted, that had hung in his own root cellar until the night it froze solid and split 24 jars clean in half. It read 6 degrees below zero. 2 thermometers, one cellar packed full, and one cellar left half empty. 47 degrees of difference between them, and Thomas Ridgway, the most respected cattleman in the valley, stood in a dead widow's supposed folly and said the only 4 words that mattered. I was wrong. He did not say it loudly. He did not say it more than once. In that country, it didn't need repeating. He asked, before he left that night, to see the ledger sheet kept. Every jar dated, every seal checked, every degree recorded twice daily since the first hard frost in November. He read it by lantern light at her kitchen table for the better part of an hour, saying nothing, running one cracked finger down the long column of numbers that told the whole story without a single word of argument in it. Not a single jar lost to freezing. Not one. 6 lost to the November spoilage. And every one of those accounted for, diagnosed and corrected before the siege ever arrived. A cellar that had held steady between 38 and 42 degrees for 11 straight days while the world outside it dropped to 39 below and stayed there. 400 jars, Ridgway said finally, closing the ledger. I called it a grave. Adam Meacham called it a grave. Half this valley called it a grave, Mrs. Calloway, and it turned out to be the only warm room in 30 miles. Esther didn't answer that either. She only refilled his cup of coffee and let the numbers do what numbers do, which was end an argument that words never could have. The knock came 2 nights later, well past midnight, while the long siege was still grinding through its 10th day, with no sign of breaking. Esther woke to the sound of it, soft, uncertain, almost apologetic, and found on her porch, half frozen and swaying on their feet, the Pruitt family from the east end of the valley, whose own cellar had failed entirely on the 6th night, their stores lost to frost, and their woodpile buried past reach under drifts 12 feet deep against their north wall. Hollis Pruitt, who had laughed the loudest at the glass grave back in October, stood on Esther's porch now with his wife and 3 children behind him, none of them able to meet her eyes, and he did not manage more than a few broken words before his voice gave out entirely on him. Esther did not make him finish the sentence. She did not remind him of a single word he'd said in the Mercantile that autumn. She only opened the door wider, took the smallest Pruitt child's hand in her own, and said, "There's room enough. Come in out of it." That night, and for 6 nights after, the Pruitt family slept in Esther Calloway's cabin, ate from Esther Calloway's cellar, and warmed themselves by a stove Esther Calloway kept fed without complaint. She never once mentioned the glass grave. She never brought up the schoolyard or the mercantile or a single unkind word that had ever been said about her jars. On the 3rd night, one of the younger Pruitt boys, the same one who'd called May Jar Girl that October, sat across from her at the supper table, eyes down on his bowl, and mumbled an apology so quiet she had to lean in to hear it at all. Esther just nodded and passed him more bread. She let the jars speak for themselves, the way she always had, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that there was no satisfaction in being right that felt as good as simply having enough to share. By the time the snow finally broke in late January and the valley began, slowly, to take stock of what the long siege had cost it, word of Esther Calloway's cellar had traveled to every homestead within 30 miles. 2 families had lost cattle by the dozens. One family, 3 ridges over, had lost a grandfather to the cold entirely. Found the same way Daniel Calloway had once been found, close enough to home that it broke something in everyone who heard about it. Against that cost, 400 jars and one widow's stubbornness looked less like folly with every retelling. Neighbors who had lost their own stores began building the same way that spring, deep, packed tight, a single narrow breathing line built low and wide, walls thick with fieldstone and straw, shelves built to hold not 40 jars, but 400. Nobody in Sweetwater Valley called it the glass grave anymore. By the following winter, when 3 more homesteads had built the same and survived a lesser but still hard freeze without losing a single jar between them, the valley had given the design a new name entirely, the Calloway Cellar. And it was said, without a trace of the mockery the old name had carried. Said instead, the way a person says the name of a tool they trust. The idea outlived the argument, the way good ideas in that country always eventually did. Esther Calloway never once corrected anyone who thanked her for it. She only nodded, the way her grandfather used to nod, and went on filling jars every summer for the rest of her life. Because a cellar, once you understood it properly, was never really finished. It only ever waited for the next winter to prove itself against. The strongest protection a person can build isn't always the one that looks strongest from the outside. Sometimes it's the quietest room in the house, full, not empty, packed with everything the cold would otherwise come looking for. Esther Calloway understood that before anyone else in Sweetwater Valley was willing to believe it. And she carried 400 jars down a ladder, alone, to prove it. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. If your neighbors had watched you filling a cellar nobody understood, mocking you the whole way through, would you have stopped carrying jars, or would you have kept going, the way Esther did, until winter itself was forced to admit you were right?